Good afternoon and welcome to the 208th of the COVID calls. This is a daily discussion of the COVID-19 pandemic with a diverse collection of disaster experts. My name is Scott Gabriel Knowles. I'm a historian of disasters at Drexel University in Philadelphia. Today is a COVID calls history of public health and medicine session with Deborah Levine and Jacob Steer-Williams. Just a reminder, you can catch COVID Calls live every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time on YouTube. Just go to the COVID Calls YouTube channel to watch. You can also watch COVID Calls on Facebook Live and on Periscope. You can hear COVID Calls anytime, recorded as podcasts on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean, or anywhere you get podcasts. You can also keep up with COVID Calls via Twitter using the handle @US of Disaster or @COVID Calls. Please do help spread the word and send suggestions for future guests and future topics, and please feel free to suggest yourself as a future guest. As of today, January 25th, 2021, there are 2,135,697 deaths globally from COVID-19. That's according to the Johns Hopkins University Coronavirus Resource Center. There are 25,217,690 cases reported in the United States. There are today 420,267 deaths reported in the United States from COVID-19. That's up from 408,011 reported last Thursday, which is the last day that I broadcast COVID Calls. As a way to bring humanity to the numbers, I've been reading a life story or a story of advocacy for those impacted by the pandemic, and I'd like to continue that now. The headline is Health Experts Urge Confidence in Vaccine After Superstar's Death. This appeared January 22nd in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution by Brad Schrade and Eric Sturgis. When Hank Aaron and other African-American leaders invited reporters to watch them receive COVID-19 immunization shots on January 5th, 2021, the baseball legend said he did so to help spread the word to millions that the vaccine is safe. It felt good, Aaron said afterward at the Morehouse School of Medicine where the event was held. Now, just over 2 weeks later, public health experts and some of the Black leaders with Aaron that day worried that an event that drew so much publicity could inadvertently serve to undermine confidence in the vaccine. Within minutes of news breaking Friday morning of the baseball great's death, those with doubts about the vaccine turned to social media to try to draw a connection to Aaron's recent immunization. That worries Joe Beasley, one of the activists who received the Moderna vaccine shot alongside Aaron. I hope this won't have a chilling effect on our people, said Beasley, 84. We can't afford it because too many people are dying from COVID-19. The cause of death was not announced, but the Braves, the Atlanta Braves baseball club, said that Aaron died peacefully in his sleep. Public health officials have been girding for weeks to fend off rumors and questions about vaccine safety, especially in the age of social media, where unsubstantiated claims can be challenging to tamp down. In some parts of Georgia, fewer than half of healthcare workers and nursing homes aides are getting vaccinated out of safety concerns. Vaccine reluctance is fueled in part by the speed with which the Moderna and Pfizer vaccines were developed and authorized, although the clinical trials that took place last year involved tens of thousands of people and were approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. All the data in these huge clinical trials did not support a role for vaccine in causing death, said Dr. Walter A. Orenstein, a former director at the CDC's immunization program and a professor at the Emory Vaccine Center. My fear is people will act emotionally and not get vaccinated. My fear is that people misinterpret this and say, aha, see, the vaccine is dangerous, when in fact there's no science data to support that hypothesis at all. Michael Osterholm, director of the Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy at the University of Minnesota, said the proximity of Aaron's death to such a highly publicized vaccine is a teaching moment for public health officials to use facts to calm people's fears. He said in a program where millions of older Americans and those with serious health conditions are being vaccinated, some are going to die of heart attacks, strokes, and other causes that have nothing to do with a vaccine. We have to have the public understand that all of these events in life occur on a routine basis, he said. and that, coincidentally, they're going to occur in the same time period that a vaccine would occur. And they have nothing to do with the vaccination any more than if they had, taken a ride in a car the day before. The car had nothing to do with it. The World Health Organization this week released findings after a series of deaths in elderly people with severe illness in nursing homes in Norway caused concerns about vaccination, but the review didn't find evidence that the Pfizer vaccine caused the deaths. Dr. Carlos Del Rio, an infectious disease expert at Emory School of Medicine, said the much bigger risk to frail older people is the coronavirus. We have 4,000 COVID-19 deaths every day in our country, he said. We need to put things in perspective. I'm more afraid of COVID than I am of the vaccine. Aaron, who was 86, suffered from arthritis and had a partial hip replacement after falling in 2014, and he used a wheelchair at the Morehouse event. Andrew Young, a former ambassador and Atlanta mayor, got his vaccine shot that day with Aaron. Young and others interviewed Friday said they have not had any severe reactions to the shot. Young, 88, who worked alongside the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. during the civil rights movement, said he's taken vaccines all his life and remains confident in their safety. Young said of Aaron, it was his time, and he has made a great contribution to the city and nation and to baseball as well. I'm going to add a section from a second story just to give a little bit more perspective on Hank Aaron. This is a story that was published in the Associated Press January 22nd as well by Paul Newberry. Hank Aaron's journey to Babe Ruth's home run record was hardly pleasant. He was the target of extensive hate mail as he closed in on Babe Ruth's cherished record of 714 home runs. If I was white, all America would be proud of me, Aaron said almost a year before he passed Ruth, but I'm black. Aaron was shadowed constantly by bodyguards and forced to distance himself from teammates. He kept hateful letters, a bitful reminder of the abuse he endured and never forgot. It's very offensive, he once said. You can't ignore them. They're here, but this is just the way things are for black people in America. It's something you battle all your life. After retiring in 1976, Aaron became a revered, almost mythical figure, even though he never pursued the spotlight. He was thrilled when the United States elected Barack Obama as its first African-American president in 2008. Former President Bill Clinton credited Aaron with helping carve a path of racial tolerance that made Obama's victory possible. You've given us far more than we'll ever give you, President Clinton said at Aaron's 75th birthday celebration. Okay, we're going to turn to our discussion for today. I've got two really great guests. Let me introduce them. Deborah Levine is Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Health Policy and Management at Providence College. A historian of medicine who regularly writes and teaches on health policy, Professor Levine has recently drawn on insights from the history of medicine in articles in the Washington Post about vaccines and low-tech technologies for managing COVID-19. Prior to teaching at Providence College, Levine earned a PhD in the history of science at Harvard University and completed a postdoc in the Andrew M. Mellon Modeling Interdisciplinary Inquiry postdoctoral fellowship program at Washington University in St. Louis. Recent academic publications have ranged from the history of the calorie in United States health policy, health insurance markets, and fitness trackers. My second guest is Jacob Steer Williams. He's a historian of epidemic disease and public health and an associate professor at the College of Charleston. He's the author of the recently published book, The Filth Disease, Typhoid Fever and the Practices of Epidemiology in Victorian England, with the University of Rochester Press. Jacob has been active as well during the COVID-19 pandemic in engaging in public scholarship, writing op-eds in local and national media outlets, giving public lectures, and organizing an oral history project in Charleston. Jacob and Debbie, thanks so much for making time to come on COVID Calls today.
Thanks, Scott.
Thanks for having us.
I'd like to start the way I usually do, just find out where you are and how the pandemic is there today. Debbie, let me start with you.
Sure. I'm in Rhode Island. I teach at a small liberal arts college, Providence College, in Providence, Rhode Island. And today was our first day of classes. That was pushed back a bit in order to do repopulation testing on repopulating the campus. And so that's what's been going on at Providence College, and I'm sort of refreshing the dashboard to see how that has been going. I'll let you know if they post. And then I live in Rhode Island, where we are at around a 5% positivity rate in testing, down from 6.5% a week ago, and significantly higher than that when we were a global hotspot back in December. We're lagging behind the rest of New England in vaccinations. We have only about 14,000 people of around 1 million fully vaccinated so far. And the health department just updated 9 Rhode Islanders died of COVID-19 yesterday, and 347 were hospitalized. And so that's the numbers of what the pandemic looks like where I am. Beyond those specifics, the pandemic is similar in Rhode Island today to where many are in the United States, laying bare many problems in our society, our public health infrastructure, our politics. The lives of some are radically different. Others are sick or dying or dead, but the lives of others go on, for now more or less unchanged, all in the same small geographic space.
Thanks for that update. You know, one of the things that's really been fascinating and interesting for me to watch are metro areas that are at the junction point of multiple different states. Washington, D.C. is a good example of this, but Providence is as well, given the size of the state. I wonder if that's something that has been very evident, that Massachusetts and Rhode Island and Connecticut might have maybe quite similar, but still different in important ways, public health approaches to the pandemic that somehow reflected on the ground there.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, radically different. I think one of the things that people have been talking about in many spaces has been the problems with the lack of a strong federal plan for addressing the pandemic, and relying so much on states to set their own policies, using their own resources in many cases. And one of the ways in which that's so absurd in terms of how that plays out here in New England, where states are small, and in Rhode Island, which is, as you know, the smallest of the 50 states, is, you know, for a while there remain rules about quarantining when crossing state lines, and all of the kinds of rules that are out there. But many of us live and work in different states. The good grocery store is over the border in Massachusetts, perhaps. You know, all of these kinds of day-to-day ways in which those state borders, before the pandemic, seemed really meaningless, and now all of a sudden carry this real policy meaning and health meanings.
I just want to stay with one more sort of preliminary question for you, Debbie, that maybe we can come back to. Has Rhode Island actually gone through with changing the name of the state as well?
Yes, we have. Yes. So in November, the people of Rhode Island finally, I think it was the third time it went to the ballot, but it was the first time since I was here. I'm not 100% sure on that. But we are no longer Rhode Island and Providence Plantations. We are Rhode Island.
This is maybe a broader conversation, but it's interesting to me that took place this year, that finally got across the finish line. And, you know, because Rhode Island and Providence Plantations, the naming of it and Providence's own history in the slave trade is something that a lot of Americans are just now learning about. A lot of white Americans are learning about for the first time, I think, this year. So part of this broader disaster year that we had in 2020.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. And I think that, you know, I'm seeing curriculums. I have young children in elementary school, and they're learning about Rhode Island's essential role or central role to the slave trade in elementary school, which is, I think, a new development. And I also am seeing more and more people talking about the ways in which, you know, the money that finances our institutions in Rhode Island is so suffused with the history of slavery in the United States.
Jacob, let me bring you in just before I turn you loose to tell us what things are like there. I just want to remind folks that I had Jacob on went back and looked, May 13th. You were on with Monica Green, which was a really fascinating conversation. Do you remember how many deaths there were at that point?
Like you, I did my homework, Scott.
Okay.
So it seemed like that was a lifetime ago.
Yeah.
But here's some perspective that I think helps like launch into this discussion about the pandemic. So in South Carolina, where I am, on May 13th of 2020, The state reported 8,030 cases and 362 deaths due to COVID-19. We are some months later, and as of today, January 25th, 2021, our state DHEC reported 418,000 cases of COVID and 6,547 deaths. Today, our percent positive cases, so compare this to Debbie's experience in Providence, is 25.4%. It's really astounding to me to put that into perspective. Not only to have the comparison with Debbie, another city, Charleston, fundamental to the slave trade and history of uneven racial politics, but just to think about how we experience this pandemic, like all pandemics, even within one country, even along one coast, in vastly different ways. There's a kind of way in which I think, I, like many people, I wake up and I look at the COVID numbers, for the U.S. and for the world, and I think those big numbers nationally or globally, you can get sort of lost in the magnitude of them. But when you make it hyper local at a state or even a city level, it puts that natural disaster of the pandemic into some focus, I think. So, the 6,547 deaths. And I say that, and Scott, I notice you also do this a lot too. The numbers matter, right? Not just 6,500, but 6,547 deaths in my state since the pandemic started. I mean, those are neighbors, they're friends, they're colleagues, they're friends of friends. I mean, the networks that bind us together in communities are being devastated right now. And when you put some of those numbers and you humanize them, it makes this more real.
What's it looking like on your campus right now, Jacob?
Yeah, so even at a more hyper local level, where I teach my university, the College of Charleston is an urban campus right downtown Charleston. We're experiencing a surge of cases in the third week of classes. Our university chose not to, unlike Debbie's university, delay the start of the semester. So we started right on time in the spring, like we had planned to do. And we have faculty teaching classes in person. And there's been no pivot to exclusive online learning. There's been little to no enforcement of COVID regulations, even though they exist on our campus, mask wearing, social distancing, and there's no mandatory testing as of yet. So it's all volunteer testing. And over the weekend, we had a surge. So as of this morning, we have 96 students in isolation, and we have an additional 151 that are being quarantined. I spoke to a colleague of mine who works in Res Life, and she said they're completely overwhelmed and they don't have spaces to do quarantining right now.
A story like that would have been on the front page of the New York Times in September. That I think we've all experienced this problem, and this is something we'll talk about as well, a sort of a fatigue in which we become inured to certain things that even 6 months ago we might have thought was impossible to become used to. But even on our campuses and in our workplaces, not just in higher education, things that seemed completely impossible to accept in the workplace for the fall semester have now become, I don't want to say totally normalized, because as you say, the faculty are paying attention, the students are paying attention, there's public health processes underway, but it's no longer unthinkable, is it?
Yeah, that's right. There's I think it's not normalized, but I think we become desensitized. And I think that's part of pandemics and, natural disasters, in general. I think, if you talk to people after Hurricane Katrina, the immediate aftermath of that natural disaster, 3 months from then, I think there was a sort of desensitization as well. So I think we can view this in a sort of broader lens.
That's one of the things that I find kind of flummoxing, though. I think, this summer there was a lot of optimism on college campuses, certainly on the campus I work on, and all of the language was kind of, if there are cases, what will we do? Mm-hmm. And then we had a surge in the third week of the fall. We had a pivot to remote education. We had coming back into the classroom. There was a whole kind of up and down to it. And so I have experienced that really as, okay, well, why, the situation hasn't changed. Why would this be different this spring? And so I think the sort of space for optimism to me seems to be kind of closed, even as the people who are having the optimism, there seems to be more of them. And so I think that's a really interesting way of putting that's not a part of the fatigue I've really thought about, is kind of I have been thinking a lot about fatigue with my students and family members as kind of these individual choices, but not so much about it from an institutional perspective.
I think we've also reached the part of this disaster in which risk management is just playing a crucial role. And when I say risk management, I mean offices at universities and other institutions that are doing cost-benefit analysis right now. And, the fear of the lawsuits that were going to come if students got sick or faculty got sick, someone died on one side, measured on the other side, versus students and their parents who are expressing concern that they're not getting their money's worth. And there are other factors, of course. I'm making it a little bit simple for this example, but I know that's the reality of what's being discussed inside the boardrooms and presidents and provost offices in universities across the United States, and other types of workplaces as well. I want to start in the now. I know neither one of you is an epidemiologist or practicing physician, but there's been something. It's been in the news a lot over the last weekend. And Peter Hotez was a guest that I had on a couple of weeks back, and we had a really great conversation. And he said here, and I've heard him repeat it in other places, that we need 100 million vaccinations a month in the United States to actually have a chance of bending the curve and really starting to save lives. I mean, if you want to call a vaccination project a success in the United States, that's the number he put on the board. And the Biden administration has said they want to try to reach 100 million in 100 days, which is an interesting take on what a president's first 100 days should look like. But there's a pretty radical difference between those two objectives. And Debbie, I want to ask you this first. I mean, when you hear claims like that and numbers like that being thrown around, how do you make sense of those different objectives? Because they're pretty different.
They are pretty different. And I think when I sort of look at what success means for vaccination in the next 6 months isn't necessarily about a number, right? I'm a historian. I'm interested in policy implementations. And I think if we have infrastructure and planning and public trust, if we continue to have successful vaccinations that, and the side effects continue to be minor, I think that'll build public trust in the vaccine. I assume we'll talk later about vaccine hesitancy, which is an important issue. But I am optimistic that as the vaccine gets rolled out, more people will be excited and willing to vaccinate. But I also think, politicians have different ideas than physicians and public health professionals and epidemiologists in terms of what numbers look like. And for the Biden administration, it makes every sense to kind of under-promise and over-deliver. So if it looks like we're on track, and some of the things I've been reading say we're on track to get to that number. And then they ramp up and they do even better, then that's a great sort of way to start the administration in terms of the presidency. I think there are going to be increasingly, there's the big number, which is, 100 million a month is almost hard to get your brain around. And then there are all of the populations that are eager to vaccinate. There are teachers and grocery store workers. And there's a really interesting conversation around research on vaccines for children or anyone under 16 right now. And so I think, when you're playing with scale like this, the big and the small numbers, there's a lot to unpack.
I really like, Jacob, I find it really useful what Debbie's saying about the different motivations of science communication in this sense. Let me just throw in a little problem with that, which is I have been very vocal criticizing the former president as not only a poor science communicator, but a liar. basically about science. But somehow it feels different. Or am I just giving the Biden administration a pass here? Because again, I mean, I like what Debbie's saying. There's under promising and over delivering is makes sense politically. But I don't know. I'm still, I want to know sort of what you think about that distance between those two numbers. And again, to throw one more thing on top of that, if you don't mind, that maybe neither one of those, as Debbie suggests, is the right number. It's not a number. It's a confidence measure, which will be hard to quantify, or it's the number that we should be paying attention to is elderly or African American or indigenous. Those are the numbers. So I put a lot on the plate there, but I wonder what you think of any of that.
Yeah, so I think, in the first year of experiencing COVID-19 under the leadership in this country of former President Trump, I think what we've witnessed is a failure of leadership to implement effective public health strategies. So I think with what we're seeing is with a change in administration, without seeing the rubber hit the road yet, I think a lot of people, they need the hope that this administration is going to tackle the big problems with responding and mitigating this pandemic. I mean, I think the vaccine is a kind of tangible something that people can recognize and hold on to as a sign of that hope, even though, I mean, one of the things that, as a historian of public health and as someone who actively reads public health literature, I mean, what's clear is the vaccine solution to this pandemic or any pandemic is only one part of the solution. So, we're at this moment right now. If you look at, what's happening just across this country with the vaccine itself, there are myriad problems. The CDC reported last week that over 30 million doses were distributed across the American states, but only 12 million were administered. The Pfizer vaccine is being distributed by UPS and FedEx, but Moderna is being shipped through McKesson. Different distribution networks and protocols. There have been mistakes that are happening every day in real time. So this plan of 100 million vaccines in 100 days, I think it's a sort of catchy public health kind of slogan, even if it is just that, a slogan, and the plan and the intent is to do a lot more. But I think it's part of this communication strategy and reframing how our political leaders in this country are communicating to the broader public just what it is that a president in the presidential cabinet and the broader leadership is going to do for the American people to mitigate the spread of this disease.
So if we do put the numbers aside for a second, whatever a successful number of vaccinations delivered, and as you suggest, Jacob, even that can get slippery. We're talking about numbers of doses that have arrived in clinics, numbers of shots that have been given, numbers of secondary shots. I mean, there's lots of numbers on the table there. But there's also the other pieces of this. Do we have enough people who are trained to deliver the vaccination, or even just back to what's now become somehow a central part of American protest culture, the mask. And there was a story in the New York Times just 2 days ago about Cobb County, Georgia, and a teacher had died. I don't know if you saw this. A teacher had died in the school district, and they asked for members of the school board to put on the mask as an honor to the teacher, and several of them wouldn't do it. So that's somehow, to me, you cannot disentangle that from this vaccination story, but so much oxygen is being sucked up by that vaccination. I wonder if either of you want to sort of say a little bit more about the associated pieces here, not just the vaccination, but what you think the ripple effect of the focus on that is on some of these other maybe less exciting or somehow less newsworthy parts of the overall public health approach. Debbie, can I give you the first pass at that?
Sure. I mean, I think this kind of all comes down to a concept that I really enjoy teaching in my health policy classes. That's all about the technological imperative in U.S. healthcare. Man, do we love Americans time and again choose technological fixes for a limited number of people over even incredibly effective measures for everyone. And there are lots of historical kind of antecedents of this example, but we're seeing it play out in so much real time. You see the hope around the vaccine and the kind of the pomp and circumstance of the first delivery trucks driving across the country to deliver the vaccine, kind of the conversations about the money associated with the vaccine. How much is everyone spending? How much are countries buying? All of those sorts of things really remind me of conversations that we have about all sorts of other scarce and technological resources throughout the history of public health and medicine in the United States. And then you look at the poor mask, right? The highly effective, now highly politicized, very cheap if we would just, do what we needed to do to produce effective ones domestically and distribute them. And those are often overlooked. One of the conversations that I think has been so interesting around the vaccines, kind of building off your point, is not just the staff to train them and not just the doses themselves, but we don't have enough syringes. We don't have enough. I think I was even reading that there are shortages of alcohol swabs. All of these kinds of things that are simple, that are cheap, and that are just incredibly uninteresting for some reason to broad swaths of the American public. And so watching that play out, in particular, people who are really skeptical of masks, but who are excited about the vaccine, people who are sort of, you're seeing journalists, individuals, politicians kind of going all in on this technical solution, and then having to play catch up afterwards and saying, oh, no, you're still going to have to mask and distance for quite some time. It's a really interesting tension with technology and money and communications.
I'm always a killjoy when it comes as a historian of technology, because look, I applaud the vaccine, everything that went into the production of these vaccines, and it's a much longer story than 10-month story, obviously, for these mRNA ones, certainly. But when the supply chain works, that to me is just as impressive, if not more so.
Yeah.
And this is a very extensive and exciting supply chain when you think about, the complexities of American geography and the public-private weird system that we have. I don't know how to even ask this question. I mean, Debbie, just to stay with you for this, was saying, is it just that we in the United States, we don't have a way to tell that story effectively? We're so focused on the techno fix and the expensive techno fix that has to lead, and cotton swabs and syringes can't. To put it in parentheses here, as a person who studied fire, home smoke alarms have saved more than just about any technology did in the 20th century. But you try to sell that story. It doesn't work. I fear that we're somehow lost in that, and that has had huge public health implications.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. I think that, I agree with other scholars who think about the ways in which this has become institutionalized in American life. These kind of unchecked assumptions that newer technology is better than old technology, that more expensive technology is better than less expensive technology. And not every country, Americans seem to fall for that much more than many other places that are maybe more hesitant about technical fixes, maybe more hesitant in investing in those technical fixes. And as profit pressures have gone, have grown over the last 50 years, you've seen a complete shift away from interest in the supply chain, and as certainly in American businesses, right? To disrupting what's existing, to discovering the next thing that's coming, to taking those kinds of risks. And they get rewarded with attention and investment and money. And, cotton swabs and smoke alarms don't inspire that same kind of interest in much of the certainly the discourse. And I think in the industries too.
Jacob, let me bring you in, and I've got a question here from Paula Miller, which is sort of connected, sort of adjacent to what Debbie and I have just been talking about, sort of talking about the mask, and that maybe we've seen, and this sort of connect this maybe to the vaccine discussion a little bit. Maybe it's just too hard now for public health leaders and elected leaders to engage the mask discussion. Maybe there's just not any ground to be gained there, whereas the vaccine, I mean, there's a lot of rancor about that too. But I don't know. What do you think about Paula's question and how that factors into this conversation Debbie and I are having?
Yeah, I want to thank Paula too. So Paula is one of my students in my Intro to Medical Humanities class, who I invited to our discussion. So it's
great. It's a great question.
To see her engagement here. Yeah, so I think, in some ways, and I place this blame not exclusively, but a large portion of it on former President Donald Trump, is we sort of let the cat out of the bag. I mean, COVID denialists have spent the year not wearing masks and getting away with it, despite mandates and regulations at local and state levels. Scott, you had on a friend of mine several months ago, Christos Linteris, who's a medical anthropologist. And Christos has written, he's an expert on public health and disease and in East Asia. And one of the things that Christos is really an expert on, and what he's written extensively on, is how the mask became a kind of domesticated everyday technology in the course of the early 20th century in China. And there were some real contingent reasons why that happened and when that happened, and it didn't happen in the U.S. And so to sort of imagine that with a change in political administration, we'll all of a sudden be able to convince millions of Americans who are fundamentally against wearing a mask out in public to all of a sudden that they're just going to get behind it, I think is really short-sighted. I do think that it's a serious challenge for this administration, is to be able to evince a kind of a reality of how much good something so simple, such a simple technology can do at this time.
I would also just that's such a good point. And Paula, I really like your question, and I would point you towards just. Maybe I'm being a bit too optimistic, but while Trump and the Trump administration and the politicizing of masks is a terrible thing that happened this year, there have been other public health interventions that have sort of pushed those same buttons about individual liberties and infringement on health. I think about seatbelt laws and laws about installing seatbelts, which now feels so routine to us, but was highly controversial at the time. I've studied the history of obesity and health policy in the United States, and very similar arguments about the idea of individuals having rights to really big sodas, or to school children having rights to French fries and pizza in schools. All of these kinds of things have been framed in this question of individual rights, and actually individual kind of consumer rights, which is not the only way to frame the question about individual liberties, right? But it is one that with public health interventions, people have kind of returned to over and over again.
Let's just stay on this track for a second, because I'm sort of curious how both of you might bring history to bear a bit on this very strange moment we find ourselves in, where we had one very distinctive federal approach to the disaster, which was more or less non-intervention, I think, just let the states manage, to now what's going to look like what we might consider a sort of a normal response. It's going to look very robust to us because we've seen it compared to nothing. Some have described this as a natural experiment or a natural social science experiment. I'm not sure how comfortable I am with that, but it's certainly going to be two different approaches. Do we have historical examples like this to draw from? And I think my question at the core of that is, how possible is it for a government to change public opinion in the middle of a pandemic, or to change is too strong, but to begin to shape public opinion in one direction in the middle of a pandemic? Do we have some history to draw from on this? Either one of you want to answer this? Jacob?
Go ahead, Debbie. I can speak to some global kinds of.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be in the U.S. I'm just curious about that, because that seems to be what's on the table right now.
Yeah, it's really interesting to think about. I mean, I'm struggling to find a clear historical corollary. We're in the middle of a pandemic. There's a change of political administration, but I mean, one of the things that I keep coming back to and thinking about this question is, early in the pandemic, we saw former President Trump disavow American support of the WHO. And now with the change of a political administration, we see American reinstatement of American support of the WHO. And that's really, I'm paying real close attention to that as a kind of real tangible kind of intervention here. Because, one of the, speaking of the, continue our discussion of the vaccines, one of the historical examples we have of a vaccination story in the 20th century and quite recent history, as you both know, and many of your listeners will know, is the global eradication of smallpox campaign of the WHO announcing in 1980 that smallpox was eradicated. And what's so interesting about that example is when that project began in the 50s, and $2.5 billion were spent on that campaign. It's scholars have looked at. One was in lieu of other campaigns, so it was ramping down global efforts to stop yellow fever, malaria, hookworm, and focusing on smallpox. And it required a real global solution. And it was one that really depended on health surveillance and new kinds of technology at a global level. And so while our former, president really was focused on a very narrow, hands-off solution in this country, I'm hoping that we both see a more, federal response, but also a global response. So that's kind of where my focus is, and as we change the political administration, what I'm looking and hoping to see.
Debbie, what's your take on this? The possibility that a change in government can also drive some sort of a broader change in public opinion around any kind of efficacy in intervention?
I'll be watching really closely. It's something that I'm hopeful about. I like that the smart and competent people that are on the team are encouraging people to wear masks and social distance. I do think that there is power in that example. I don't know how much of I don't know how much power there is. I don't know how much power there is with people who, those of us who are still paying attention. We're already doing those things. In the people that have kind of turned their backs to it, it's really hard to know. I actually think that's going to be one of the most interesting things to track going forward is in the absence of these very loud voices coming out of places of power, what that might look like. And I'm not confident to predict.
Yeah. The other thing, if I could just jump in here real quick, that strikes me, as Debbie was talking about some of the historical precedents here of sort of public health in action. If you go back to the early 20th century in American history and in American public health, you see American public health officials across the country doing real grassroots organizations that try to curb the major infectious diseases. And we often, and historians sort of used to look at this through a kind of progressive lens of development and public good. And, in the last, couple decades, historians have shown how, while at the same time that was happening, public officials were blaming and targeting immigrants, people of color, women. And so while, I think there's a tension here that the history really illuminates, that we might also be expecting that as we give maybe more power and authority to public health officials, we also got to make sure that we don't repeat all the same ways in which public health has been a tool of injustice in this country.
Well, actually, that's pretty good. We didn't plan this, but let's stick with this. It's a good segue. We're getting a lot of great questions in today. I want to thank everybody who's posting a question. We may not get to all of them, but Juliet Arnheim is asking, the states are now following CDC guidelines that suggest vaccinating the public by descending age group. The question here is how and who should decide priorities in the future when there are limited health resources. I like that question, and I like how it attaches to what you were just saying, Jacob, in this broader sense. I mean, policy decisions will be made. public health officials are making decisions at this point, decisions that were deferred or not made last year at the federal level, mask mandate or not, for whom, under what conditions, scarce resource of vaccine, what federal guidelines will be given from the CDC. If states don't follow those guidelines, what will the federal, I mean, a tangle of questions here. Let's start with Juliet's specific question. Jacob, what do you think?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And, when you were introducing Debbie and you were talking about a city like hers that sits at this apex of several different states, I think here is where, we're really going to have to pay close attention. In this country, it's kind of a tricky example compared to many other countries where, because of our federalist system, we give a lot of, responsibility to states to make and especially to enforce laws and regulations. So, what we've seen so far during this outbreak is a complete, what I just keep telling people and students is just the wild, wild west out there with dealing with COVID. It's everybody sort of doing things on their own and very unevenly. And so, if we can't come up with some real clear federal guidelines for states to adhere to, I'm afraid we're going to all be running down different rabbit holes. I spent last week, I wake up early because I have two small children anyway, but I spent 2 days last week waking up early, clicking on the Publix website for my parents who live in Florida and my in-laws that live in Florida, on trying to get them signed up for a vaccine. I mean, that's not an effective public health approach to distributing a vaccine. And that's a result of us just throwing the responsibility of dealing with this pandemic on states. And then, and more than that, on individual people. And so if we don't come up with some, to me, some real federal oversight here, then we're just going to keep spiraling down these separate holes.
And I would also add that this also pokes at another key cultural tension in our healthcare system. And so the United States, within our healthcare discussions, we are not comfortable with discussions about rationing. We believe in this myth that we don't ration healthcare in the United States. That's something that those socialist countries do somewhere else. And of course, that's not true. Many historians have shown, and other scholars have shown, all kinds of ways that we ration care. And also anyone who pays attention can see that we ration care according to the job you have, or that we ration insurance according to the job you have. We ration insurance according to age, right? If you're 65 and older, you have, and you qualify, you have access to Medicare. Underneath, you don't. So there are many mechanisms of rationing, but it remains this sort of taboo subject in American healthcare. People don't want to engage in that. And I think one of the things that we're noticing in talking about vaccines is here is something where there's a limited supply and there's a ton of demand, and we have to come up with a way that rations those. And some people are perfectly comfortable saying, well, the people with money and the people who have the Wi-Fi to jump on the website as soon as they can should be the ones to get those. That's the free market. That's how our healthcare system works. And those of us who are trying to inject more discussions about equity, about prioritization, are really running into this stream that runs so deep in the American healthcare system around this question of rationing.
Really glad that you brought that up, and it ties back to something you were saying earlier about this. It's not surprising, I guess, in the American political economy, but that the individual is the unit that we're going to focus on. So, we're looking at individuals in the society being made sick. We're looking at, how much suffering, what's the wait time for an individual, and that rationing. I think for me, when I think about, my own education in American history, the rationing, the penny drives, and the everything that went on during World War II, let's say, that's treated as an almost unimaginable moment in American history but people would go without,
Well, and when did the idea of rationing as patriotic, which you're sort of pointing to, right? This idea is rationing as your patriotic duty to take care of one another. How did that? I mean, we know how, but one of the questions that, I think we're sort of forced to face is how did we come so far from that, right? Where rationing is seen as we haven't even heard the word. I haven't seen the word rationing in connection
No.
to vaccines, right? We're talking about prioritization and other things like that, and it's really seen as this infringement on an individual's or a referendum on their worth to society, a referendum, all kinds of things work is getting done there.
But it's still, and I feel like we're right in the middle of it, so it's going to take some time to figure out. But I'm really fascinated by the direction you're taking that, because you could imagine a quite powerful framing, but maybe it was necessary to do it in April of last year to say, look, the nation has to pull together, and not everybody's going to have access to everything all at the same time here. We're asking for people who can go without to go without at this time. And instead, it's been mass hysteria at the supermarket because people couldn't get toilet paper. And it's the kinds of stories, Jacob, your story resonates completely with me, talking to my father, calling all around the countryside to try to get access to a vaccine. Yeah. And that sort of encourages this notion that I kind of don't want my neighbor to know. I don't really want to talk about that with my neighbor. If I find out there's shots at CVS, do I sneak over there and get the shot? That's not a healthy way to approach the greatest pandemic in American history since 1918. I mean, I'm saying the ought instead of the is right now, but how can we disagree with that?
That's right. And also really stoking the dangerous existing resentment that we've seen raging over the last few years. I keep coming back to Florida Governor Rick Scott, who gave this offhanded sort of comment like, we're not going to vaccinate some 25-year-old health orderly in a nursing home when we have all of these, other people who are, in the parentheses, right, more deserving, more worthy, more resilient. I'm not really even, there are so many parts to that, but it was just this offhanded shorthand for, I don't want to give my vaccine to them, and sort of othering this group of people who, every expert agrees should be the absolute first to get the vaccine for many, many reasons. I'm overstating a little, maybe not every expert and all those other things. But, he said it, and then I've been hearing it get picked up, here and there and there. It resonated.
I want to remind folks that you're listening to COVID Calls and talking today about public health, the history of medicine, vaccines, and vaccination with Debbie Levine and Jacob Steer-Williams. Jacob, I'm sorry I cut you off there. Please go ahead.
No, one of the things that I was thinking about too with this vaccine delivery question is there is pretty widespread agreement amongst public health officials about states starting with frontline healthcare workers and those over 65. But after those categories, there actually is quite a bit of uncertainty as to how the vaccine should get rolled out. And we're seeing on the one hand a lot of opportunism, people saying, well, how is it that whatever my personal problem is, how may I qualify for the vaccine to bump myself up on the priority line, right? And what I fear is, that as the science, we're also, one of the things we're dealing with in the middle of this natural disaster is that the science is changing every day too. So not only do we see, things that I'm not seeing in the front page headlines, like a new UK variant and a new South African variant, how does that new scientific information play into vaccine delivery? But what also happens at the cultural level, I got into a fight the other day with somebody on social media, which I've really been trying not to do this year, but it has happened, where somebody commented and they say, once I get, I'm signed up for my vaccine, and once I get my first shot, the first thing I'm going to do is go to a steakhouse and get drunk at a bar, and I just blasted this person for saying that. But I think there is some real, there's a real public health problem underfoot, that as we get more vaccines available, we get more people being reckless. And I'm really worried about that. I'm seeing that in my own community. Our bars are packed in downtown Charleston, and restaurants on a daily basis. We have a huge tourist economy, and law enforcement's pretty unwilling to enforce things as a result of those interventions.
Is that a historical phenomenon that we can observe in a pandemic? If the curve gets bent, or if there's less reporting going on, or for some reason public perception of the threat goes down, that people actually increase their risky behavior, they stop averting the risk? Have we seen that in other cases that you guys are aware of?
Well, the example that's coming to my mind right now is the cyclical way that we fund public health initiatives within U.S. health policy, which is it's really like a non-policy. We go from crisis to crisis, and as the crisis seems to turn, then we stop funding. So we had a very successful, this is a small example, but we had a very successful lead abatement program here in Rhode Island. Rhode Island has old housing stock. We are also, we have a lot of absentee landlords, and we're a relatively poor state for our region. And so we had very high, all of those things combined together, and we had very high lead exposure rates. We then the federal government and other agencies staffed up and funded up a very successful lead abatement program here in Rhode Island over 10 years. But as the incidence and prevalence of lead poisoning dropped, the funding went away. So when I talk about this with my students, I always end with a question of like, and what is it like now? Has it gone, we have numbers through 2012. What has the last 8 years looked like? But the answer is we don't really know, because the perception of the emergency faded, and then the attention and the funding went away. So that's not exactly a corollary to what you were talking about, but it does speak to this kind of issue of the way that we have addressed public health in the past.
Actually, I think it's a much better framing of what I was putting out there, which is that I think I fell a bit into my own trap there. We shouldn't be necessarily looking at how individuals answer a Pew Research poll. We should also be looking at the institutional frameworks within which they're trying to make sense of things, but also the policymakers themselves who are driving what these priorities would be. We assume there's a sort of relationship there. The members of Congress can get voted in and out. The president can get voted in and out. They'll set health policy. But it's not as exact as all that. And what you've described, I think, is a great example where, you could have health policy going one direction in a sort of a crisis intervention mode. This happens across disasters, not just public health, right? A lot of discussion about a type of building code or flood insurance or something like that. And then it recedes. The distance sometimes it's about you get a certain distance away from a disaster, and so it just fades from public consciousness, media attention drops, or there is an electoral calculus so that these things become hotter as you get closer to an election and cooler when you get away, when there's less of a reward for politicians to pay attention to something like that.
If I could just add one thing for listeners who are interested in reading more about this, there is an elegant and beautiful article in Health Affairs by historian Elizabeth Fee that sort of charts out some of these examples of, and it's a really short piece, and it charts out some really nice examples of kind of the way we're like a moth to the flame, scattering from disaster to disaster too often in U.S. public health. And I should also say, there's a lot that U.S. public health has done really well, and there have been a lot of successes, and there are a lot of excellent individuals doing really important work across the country. I feel like I suddenly realized I was focusing on critical negatives.
No, and I always like it when people give us reading assignments. Historians are good for that. And so with that, let me just turn just for a second here. We're almost up on time, actually, but my guests have agreed to stay for a few more minutes, which I greatly appreciate. I would like to talk about teaching a little bit. We started our conversation talking about your own teaching at this time. Obviously, from this conversation, I'm sort of really wishing I had had an opportunity to take a class with either or both of you when I was an undergraduate. Your command and breadth of what you're bringing to bear to understand this pandemic is impressive. Take us behind the scenes a little bit. How has your approach to public health history of medicine pedagogy changed, if at all, throughout this last year? Jacob, let me start with you on that, and then Debbie will come to you.
So before COVID-19 started, I've been teaching at my university for 8 years, and every semester I teach a history of public health or a history of disease class. And my last lecture that I always used to say, and I really sort of built this huge, grand finale lecture to just say at one point in your lives, students, you're going to experience a pandemic. and you're equipped to see it now in different ways. And I've had to really pivot because now we're living inside of one. And so this semester I'm teaching a medical health humanities class, and I've designed it just as a COVID class. We're just trying to, see what various disciplines and scholars can help us to understand this moment. And I've just been completely overwhelmed at the student response. We're in week 3, mind you, but I mean, in no other time in my teaching career have students been more willing and engaged with a subject than now. And that's, I've been trying to really reflect almost every day on that. We're all overstimulated with pandemic anxiety right now. And not everybody can be or is up to speed with the rapid changes in the science or in our responses, either locally or state or federally or globally. And so, I've been asking students to really empower them to say that they're part of this process. They're part of this history in the making. So I've been asking them to journal their experiences, and particularly to talk about something that historians don't always talk about, and scholars in general, is their emotional responses to the pandemic. That's something I've been really keying in on, of being forthright with my students, with my own emotional responses during this pandemic, in my own personal life and my teaching life, and to get them to think through that as well. And the response has been, it's been overwhelming. So, students have told me about their isolation, being in their rented homes with 3 other roommates, and 2 of whom are COVID positive, and they're afraid to come out of their dorm rooms. Students who have lost friendships over the pandemic because friends they once had are, COVID denialists and out engaging in risky behavior. Students who are at odds with their family members over the COVID politics. And, those are all things that have happened to me too, in my personal life. And I think it's really, it's been cathartic in a way to talk to students about this at a level of emotional responses to the pandemic. And also to see, that humans in the past have experienced pandemics and natural disasters before. That doesn't always help us to understand and get out of this situation. But I think it does humanize it.
Debbie, let me bring you in on that as well. Jacob, thank you so much for sharing that. I just want to insert a little comment, and then Debbie, turn to you and your sort of teaching experience. I have found that as well. I know we all were asked a lot back in March and April. It's kind of a version, people don't ask it this way. They're like, what are we paying all this money for historians for again, if you guys can't tell us that there's a good lesson from the past that we should be following here? And I actually found myself really grasping until I hit on the fact that, for me at least, that it was the reservoir of the history of emotion and memorial that has made the greatest sense to me as something to pull from history that is helpful, useful, I don't know what the right term here, but absolutely resonant. And World War I, the sort of missing aspect of the influenza from a lot of sort of public consciousness, it bothered me for a long time until I realized that trauma was subsumed in World War I, and you can find a lot of World War I trauma out there. It's one trauma. And that was an insight to me that it's really, what you're saying, Jacob, sticks a lot with what I've been experiencing, and also trying to find some openness and honesty to talk to students. I taught a COVID-19 course over the summer, which I look back now is like teaching a Hurricane Katrina course about the time before the levees broke. But I'm glad I did. But it was a preliminary. It was a first take. Debbie, I didn't mean to cut you off there. I just want, before I forgot that thought, what's your teaching like?
Oh, no. Not at all. Not at all. That's so fascinating. Yeah, so in some ways it's similar to some of the things that you both have outlined. In the spring, when our campus shut down in March, I shifted, and instead of a final exam, I had students have the option to write a pandemic journal, kind of what every day was like. And we looked at some examples of, this is in an intro to US health policy class, but as a historian, I tend to frame things historically. So we looked at some examples of accounts of sickness from people's diaries and letters. And then they wrote they wrote some, and then I gave students the option to have those deposited to the college archives, and about 10 students elected to do that. So we're starting to create some collections of what the experience of the pandemic was like. I didn't, well, so, and I'll say that, like Jacob, I learned about conflicts between families. I learned about students becoming essentially homeless over the course of the lockdown period, the more stringent lockdown period. I learned about couples breaking up because one was going to a party and the other was taking it seriously, and just a number of things, from the mundane to the heartbreaking. And I was really pleased that my students trusted me with those stories. And as a historian, I was pleased that so many of them kind of drew parallels to their experiences of the pandemic with some of the texts that we had engaged with in the classroom. It wasn't a requirement, and they did it anyway. But I would say that, my focus on teaching this fall, and certainly into this semester, a lot of it has been on the challenges to building community during this time. And so because I'm teaching U.S. health policy and about the healthcare system, there's a lot there's a lot of content that is important to talk about, and I've rethought how I do the content in some ways. But I've spent a lot of my time thinking about kindness in the classroom, building community in the classroom, thinking about building community in virtual classroom spaces, kind of how do you teach and foster empathy in academic spaces? What does an assessment look like that puts kindness and empathy and resilience at the center? Those kinds of things, which I think could be applied to any classes. And I've been reading a lot about them. I guess the other thing is, like Jacob, I used to have, in the last week of class, I would talk about the epidemiologic transition unmade. And, now we are only focused on chronic healthcare. And will there be a moment when we are subsumed with concern about contagious and communicable diseases yet again? And of course, the answer is yes, we will. But I've dropped that from the syllabus and reframed it. I think the other big thing that's changed for me is that I used to have to do a lot of work. I teach many of my students come from very privileged backgrounds, not all, but many. They have excellent health insurance. They've had the benefit of very good health, and they're able-bodied over the course of their lifetime. And so I used to have to do a lot of work to sort of convince them to pay attention to some of the weaknesses that are so apparent to so many in our healthcare system here in the United States, and convincing them of that, particularly convincing them of some of the weaknesses in our public health infrastructure, used to take a lot of work, like a lot of scaffolding and, all of this stuff. And now it's just like, nope, we're here. Like, let's, they don't need the convincing. They just, let's talk about how to fix it. Let's talk about what the structures of the problems are. And that has helped us to have really different and I think in some ways deeper and better conversations.
Do you talk to your students? We're wrapping up now, but I did want to find out what you thought about this. Debbie, do you talk to your students about how this will end?
So I have not formally talked about sort of how pandemics end from my perspective, but I will say that I've had a number of students come to me and say, I'm done with this. I'm so done with this pandemic. I'm tired of the lockdowns. I'm tired of this. And they're in a health policy course. So presumably they're not done with thinking about health policy. And, I try to turn it around and say, really, this is the challenge of your moment and your generation. And there's a lot about this moment that, has changed what your college experience looks like. But you're not done with this because it's not done with you. And maybe there are some opportunities to write or think or research. But I need to do some more thinking about that.
Yeah. I'm impressed by that answer, though, in the sense that, of course, and I've talked with guests on COVID calls who say, I'm just so done with this, so over this. And you realize as you're having that conversation, like, no, we're not. We're just starting. And as people who analyze this, we are truly just starting. Jacob, same question to you. I mean, do you discuss this question of ending points? Historians love to periodize things and then completely disavow our periodizations. That's what we live for, I guess, to a certain extent. What do you think?
In my courses on the history of disease, by the end of the semester, students sort of come to this conclusion on their own. And I'm interested now, going forward, putting COVID in that discussion, because here's the pattern, at least, for the global history of disease, is that, the major infectious diseases that the Western world struggled with in the 19th century, slowly started to disappear in the early 20th century. Cholera, typhoid, and scarlet fever, diphtheria. And in spite of those disappearing, quote unquote, in the West, many of those diseases even today continue to impact the global South. They're not diseases that are on the front page headlines in newspapers in the Western world. And, many students come to my classroom and they've never even heard of the word cholera, what that even means. They have a hard time pronouncing that word cholera when they see it on a page. But if you look at the sort of global burdens of disease, what you really see is that sometimes pandemics don't really end. They just become endemic diseases that get pushed off on the global South. And so that's, my futuristic historian brain, keeps worrying that even if we sort of figure out COVID and it gets mitigated in the West, it's just going to become one of those other diseases that's endemic in the global South. I mean, we're seeing that with vaccines. So I was reading an article this morning that was about Nigeria, the most populous nation in Africa that has no COVID vaccines right now, which is true of many countries in the global South.
I want to remind everyone you've been listening to COVID Calls today, and you can catch COVID Calls live every weekday at 5 p.m. Eastern Time. I'm going to continue discussion tomorrow with historians. We're going to have a historians roundtable about COVID-19 and public health and the history of politics with Cindy Ermis, Tiago Saraiva, and Sandra Adair, and I hope you'll join us for that. And I want to thank my guests today, Deborah Levine and Jacob Steer-Williams, and all of the people who also put questions in today. We didn't get to all of them. We got to a few of them. It's great to have such lively engagement. Debbie and Jacob, thanks so much for your time today.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much. This was great.
Stay healthy, everybody. We'll see you tomorrow at 5 o'clock.